Right. Okay. Would you just like to test your microphone? Fergus, can you hear that microphone there? Yeah, great. Can you hear that, Fergus? Can you hear my voice? Can you hear my voice, Fergus? Yep. Okay. Right, that's good. Okay. I'll just follow you with the camera.
One good thing about having a role to play is you can take your mask off. So, good evening and welcome everyone to this second session in our March series, Relationship Between Religion and Culture. And we've diversified a little this year, so we also want to welcome those who are live streaming tonight. So, welcome. Those who are going to view, well, actually, Jonathan's attending Modbury on Sunday night for a repeat session, so welcome to Modbury people, and to those who will join in viewing online at their leisure. And also, welcome to you people, it's good to see you here. Our acknowledgement of country. Tens of thousands of years before Abraham left Ur, the ancestors of the Ghana people walked this land on where we meet tonight. We acknowledge the peoples of the Ghana nation of the Adelaide Plains, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, for their stewardship of the land throughout the ages and their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. Tonight's session is entitled Ways Christianity Relates to Culture, and our presenter is Jonathan Barker. Now, of course, Jonathan doesn't need any introduction because he's always been here. He seems to have been around forever. At least he's been involved with the Seminary of the Third Age since its beginnings. In terms of his topic on Christianity and culture, Jonathan's cross-cultural interest arose when he was involved in the Fifth City project on Chicago's west side for 1 year in 1969. Now, if you don't know anything about the Fifth City project, there's a wonderful article online just called Reshaping Community Development, the Fifth City project. So to know what I was talking about, I thought I would look that up. And it's a very interesting article which talks about the project being located amongst an almost entirely black population in one of the most depressed areas of inner city Chicago. And it sought to demonstrate, this project, the capacity of local people to transform their own communities. So it was a visionary project that Jonathan was involved in. Jonathan was also a senior community development officer with the Department of Community Welfare, and he undertook formal studies in sociology at Flinders University. He was a senior community development officer with the... I've already said that. Next bit. He lived in India for 4 years working on developmental projects, and he spent time in the mountains in the Philippines. He worked with the Moanjum Aboriginal community in the Kimberleys and had several uniting church parish ministries before he was appointed to Nungalinya College in Darwin as assistant principal and lecturer in contextual theology. Jonathan is now actively retired, which means that he has time to be actively involved in those things which are of enduring interest to him. Jonathan clearly has a broad cross-cultural basis from which to speak with us on the ways Christianity relates to culture. So, over to you, Jonathan.
Leave those there.
Thank you, Esmond, for that fulsome introduction. I would like to say that most of that you've talked about, I was accompanied by Janine in those endeavours. When you put it that way, I feel like a bit of a fraud here tonight, but we'll wait and see. I too just want to acknowledge that we're here tonight on the land of the Kaurna people. Every time we acknowledge and are welcomed by the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, we are doing a very special thing. We're acknowledging either directly or implicitly that a people of a dominant culture have to reconcile with a past that sought to wipe out the cultural identity of another very different and ancient culture. Such acknowledgements may be one small step in creating a new awareness that in the 21st century, people of diverse backgrounds have to walk together, and we, the dominant culture, have a debt to pay. Tonight I shall ramble a little, maybe a little more. I'm not an academic scholar, but I've been fortunate to have picked up some insights into life and faith and the humanising factors that have shaped me. And I acknowledge my debt to my mentors, including First Nation friends and colleagues far too many to name, who've enlightened me over my lifetime. How culture and identity and religion, specifically Christianity, relate to each other has dramatically come to the fore since the end of the 20th century. Postmodernism challenges the dominance of all grand or meta-narratives that explain everything. Relativity is a fact that many struggle with because it challenges us to decide just what is the ground on which we stand as human beings in a culture and distinctly as Christians. Tonight, I invite us to rethink where we stand as we revisit a classic work. It's Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture. Lectures originally delivered in 1949. The book's never been out of print. And I'm going to be using his analysis as a socio-theological framework and ask how his insights might still apply to us today. And from these insights, we're going to ask how they may be applicable to our relationships with First Nations people. And I shall explore reflections from my personal experiences. And so, while acknowledging the danger of oversimplification, I'm proposing a lens through which we can view our topic tonight. The lens is the perspective of dynamical relationships. Now, what's that? Firstly, or how the key components of the social process relate to each other, that is the economic, the political, and the cultural dynamics, and the cultural dimension having its own dynamics, which I call here. First of all, depth meanings. What's that? That's how a particular people understand who they are, what identifies them. How they relate to contingency, that's life and death and the unknown. How they are subjected to and saved from powers beyond their control. How stories and symbols and ceremony, sacred places and religious practices rehearse what it means to be a human being. The why. Then the dynamic of communal wisdom, which is in sync with depth meanings. What is the worldview, the received wisdom which identifies a culture? What language is used to communicate and express meanings? What are the origin stories and understandings of the created world? What wisdom is passed on essential to survival and flourishing? The key question being, what is essential to survive? The what? And then the dynamic of the social constructs in sync with communal wisdom and depth meanings. How to live together safely, harmoniously, and settle disputes. How social hierarchies and boundaries keep order. How family patterns and male and female roles are determined. How value systems, usually based on reciprocity, are observed. The key question is how to live together peaceably, the how. These are the tip of the dynamical iceberg, all in tension with each other. And of course, economics and politics have their causative effects on culture as well. For example, the differences between a hunter-gatherer and agrarian societies, the feudal and the industrial ages, and now, of course, global information-based technologies, economies. And, of course, the political power, whether autocratic or democratic, dynamics reflected in and often justified by culture. It has been contended that each culture may have embedded within it key signifying images of humanness, a meme or sometimes called an image. Yes, you are, Norm, an image. For example, logos. The logos in Western culture, the word, primarily derived from classical Greek, but with Jewish overtones. That which makes sense to everything is the rational principle. Maybe the Western obsession with meaning, which does not mean that other cultures don't have rationality, of course. And then the yin-yang in Chinese culture, that which makes sense to everything is harmony, above all else, even if it means squashing or dissent. Does that ring a bell? And while I once warmed to this proposal, I now am not sure about it. Given the Ruth Benedict examples which Olga referred to last week, our generalisations are revealed to be only very partially true, or maybe even not true at all. So, how do we, whatever our cultural background, experience these dynamics? How confidently we can claim a culture or even a mixture of cultural identities? Now, there was one word that just kept cropping up at Writers' Week this last week by different speakers, and it was the word fluidity. Well, when I was first at Normal Linear College in Darwin, which was a college, of course, sponsored by the Catholic, the Anglican, the Uniting Churches for Indigenous people, I attended and helped organise cross-cultural workshops, and they were run entirely by significant Yolngu elders of the Northern Territory who shared their culture, their key elements. They did it boldly, they did it with pride, which provoked an exclamation from one very well-known academic, who will be nameless tonight, who said, "I feel like I don't have a culture." Why would she say that? Is not, for most of us, Western culture a shared heritage? Is it so taken for granted that it can't be articulated? Is it not possible to have some pride in it? Or was it guilt over the cultural genocide we inflicted on First Nations peoples? What do you think? But coincidentally, in Darwin at the same time, I heard of the overlooked myth of Europa, which may give a clue to deeply buried images in Western cultures. I don't know whether you know it. By the way, that picture is on a euro banknote. And I don't have time to tell the whole story, but just to draw out one of its core meanings. And it's a story, the usual story of Zeus, all-powerful, having tricked Europa, who I believe was a Phoenician in the story, by taking her off in the form of a bull. Now, I don't know how she couldn't tell the difference, but that's Greek mythology. And after fathering 3 children, then agrees and bargains with him, and he agrees that he will leave her alone. That is, she could get along without any divine intervention. Is this a foretaste of the secularity that would gradually, eventually sweep over Europe? Christianity as a religion is wrapped in the dominant cultural forms of each era it's lived through. From the early Judeo-Greek context, the medieval period, the Newtonian mechanical period, when deism evolved, that's God as a being to believed in, the colonial era, and now living with the postmodern paradigm of relativity. Religious thought has always lagged behind when a new paradigm of reality emerges. I wonder why. When fundamentally different cultures and their religious expressions come into contact with each other, what happens? There will be much confusion. This slide from the late Jim Downing was used at the non-linear program that I mentioned above. Now, I would like to mention, of course, that here the setting is the Northern Territory, and the bulk of the Indigenous people who live there live their traditional culture. So what do you notice in this picture? Can you see how the lens of, on the left, the white person understands a lot of what's going on in the Western world and Western culture, but looking the other way, and that one's a male, looking, just sees a sliver of Indigenous culture. And of course the other way, an Aboriginal person, wide scope of understanding of his culture, and the other person looking the other way, Indigenous, looking at Western society, understands just a sliver. Now the second dynamical relationships that I want to refer to as a lens tonight are how we define the church. And I'm going to talk about three sociological manifestations. Firstly, the one we all know well, the historical church, which is the official structural form of the church, concerned to pass on tradition, which defines what's official, which defends itself against threats, polemics, and as a representative of the institution to the world, of course, it's on almost every other street corner, it's the local church. But then there's what I call the movemental dynamic. What is this? Well, it's a core, often dissenters, because they're uneasy of the overreach of power, often to be discovered in the institutional church. These are those who are committed to keeping the flame alive of the radical message of the gospel and being the church for others. They struggle to renew the institution because the church is their mother. By the way, Mike, I believe it was Luther who said, "The church is a whore, but she is my mother." Then there's another form, and I'm going to call this a transparent expression, which includes those who don't identify with the institutional or the movemental dynamics, but nevertheless they're people who have an affinity with the core Christian agenda, such as sharing a vision of a new world of justice and peace, and being in sync with valuing human life and love. Many in this category, in this dynamic, are sceptical of metaphysical claims and the need for a theological basis for their ethics. Paul Tillich called this the latent church. I don't like that. Karl Rahner, the great Catholic theologian, called them the invisible church. I don't like that either. I prefer to call this the transparent and dynamic. Now, when the gospel is expressed and delivered from one cultural context to another, the relationship depends a lot on whether it is via the formal institutional church or the movemental dynamic. It may be in some cases the transparent dynamic, and I'll come back to that later. Richard Niebuhr has been criticised, and by the way, here's a copy of his book. I think it says I bought this in 1967. He's been criticised by some on the grounds that he assumes that the world and the church of Christendom. Well, while I recognise this critique, I see Richard Niebuhr primarily operating out of the movemental dynamic. For example, his essay on the church as social pioneer is not about institutional Christianity, but rather the movemental dynamic, that is, the sensitive and responsive ones who are first to respond to God in Christ because they respond first to innocent suffering. That's the movemental dynamic. Now, let us come to the chart that you should all have a copy of. I think there was enough to go around. I hope everybody's got their copy because we're going to be referring to this. I've laid out Niebuhr's 5 types and what I perceive to be a grid. And you can see that, you know, the vertical one is when that particular dynamic is more enmeshed in society, and the bottom of the vertical is when they're separate from, seek to be separate from being immersed in society. The left-hand side is those who tend to be opposed to the culture and the social order of which they're a part. And on the right-hand side, of course, where they're supportive of being involved with the culture of which they're a part. So I'm going to start on the bottom left-hand corner. Faith against culture. This position uncompromisingly affirms the sole authority of Christ, best illustrated by the first Christians rejecting the claims of the dominant Roman Imperium to pledge loyalty to the emperor. No, they said, Jesus is Lord. Just note the image there, the Greek, emperor, philios divinus. No, Jesus is the only truly representative Son of God, a God reframed as the Father of all. And there's much in the New Testament that's supportive of this position, particularly the first letter of John and the book of Revelation, but also the Old Testament post-exilic community, those who edited the religious text of what we call the Old Testament, did so in favour of an exclusive faith. And of course, the favoured text above all was, "Come ye out from among them." Have you heard that before? Early writers such as Tertullian put it this way, and I'm quoting Tertullian, an early theologian, who said, "The wider world is regarded to be under the power of evil, characteristic by lies, dominated by lust and pride, a pagan society. In this position, it means having to live in the world as best as sojourners. This world is not my home. I am a stranger here." Political life and military service is to be shunned, and there assumes no obligation to participate in social transformation. And so these people then began to live on the edge as Roman persecution really took its effect. And we have the people who went out on the edges and into the desert and became the first monastic orders. They're also a good example of a slightly later time. The rule of St. Benedict, for example, and of course later the Mennonites and the Quakers. But the common factor is withdrawal from society. Some in this dynamic of being against culture were strong on criticising the institutional church for mirroring the power structures of the civil order. And the great Dane, Fergus, Kierkegaard, is a great example of that. Also the dissenting Puritans. But what are the inadequacies that Niebuhr talks about? Oops, where are we going? This position overlooks the fact that Jesus, now listen to this is quoting Niebuhr, always was one who has become human in a culture, who is not only in culture, but into whom culture has penetrated. Thus, there is no Christian faith which is not culturally bound. All the key words, Lord, Messiah, Logos, are culturally specific. As exclusively they tend to, in living exclusively, they tend to confine their Christianity to the fellowship of believers, overlooking the command of God to love God and neighbour. Their mission is about saving souls and building churches. Niebuhr highlights a basic theological flaw. Now just wait for this. He says it's based on, he wrote, this position converts ethical dualism into an ontological bifurcation of reality, so that the material world is governed by a principle opposed to Christ and a spiritual world guided by the spiritual God. So do you think you know what ontological bifurcation is now? Okay. This position is resistant to science, particularly evolution, philosophy and other religions. It's stuck in a two-story worldview. The final reward is heaven in the next life. But Niebuhr affirms the relevance of this dynamic. Christian withdrawal from and rejection of the institutions of society have maintained the distinction between Christ and Caesar. And the key to reforming the church itself is from this position. The reformers start off as a movemental dynamic, and I think of Luther, Calvin, Anabaptist, and the Puritan dissenters against the institutional and corrupted church as they saw it. Later exponents include Karl Barth, John Howard Yoder, all concerned to restore the core of Christianity, the alternative way of Jesus, as well as the necessarily reconciling process of the cross and resurrection. When a dominant culture is sick, despotic, or ruled by xenophobic autocracies, this is surely the time for the church to take a stand against what's happening in its culture. The Barman Declaration is the classic case of the 20th century. I think I'll read it out. It's there in print. The Barman Declaration, agreed to in May 1934, was adopted by the confessing Christians in Nazi Germany who opposed the German Christian church, which had been corrupted by making it subservient to the state and had introduced Nazi ideology into the German Protestant churches, a clear contradiction of the Christian gospel. This declaration is a truly historic document. It was chiefly framed by Karl Barth, but there's a wonderful picture of the framers that include a young Dietrich Bonhoeffer in it as well. But then the Kairos document, challenge to the church in 1986, was also so prophetic in its stand against apartheid and should not be forgotten. Then how does this movement relate to First Nations peoples? The global missionary movement of the 19th and 20th centuries reflected the dominant imperial values and westernised scientific learning and the theological leanings of the times. This was true for all. There was no other way to transmit the gospel other than via the cultural wrappings of the evangelists. The colonial package was inevitable. But consider these quotes. John Dunmore Lang, fiery Presbyterian. Aborigines had nothing whatever of the character of religion or religious observance to distinguish them from the beasts that perish. Or Samuel Lee, Aboriginal people are as barbarians to whom had been assigned the lowest place in the scale of intellect. Well, he has a descendant who's a Labor politician in Canberra. I don't think Justin will pass that one on to him. And the Jigalong missionaries of the Apostolic Church in Western Australia, more recently, or 1945, Aborigines are the children of the devil, lost in great darkness and steeped in sin. The law must be destroyed, that's Aboriginal law, must be destroyed and replaced with a Christian way of life. Doesn't it make you cringe? The against culture position was a double whammy. Against the world at large and against traditional culture, which was deemed pagan, of the devil, idolatrous, immoral, always presented by people in complete ignorance of the First Nations' rich cultural heritage and, ironically, an assumed superiority of the dominant culture. Many of these missions, of the early missions, were well placed. Those that tended to look upon Aborigines as having to be rescued from their culture and made like us. Many of those missions were well placed to take on the children of the stolen generations. And there the assumption was that westernisation was inevitable. We now know it as cultural genocide. But mark this, when I, in conversation with Loacher O'Donoghue at a conference in Melbourne back in, I think, 1997, that our church youth group, a church down here in Kings Park, used to be part of this parish here, that we had painted Colebrook home twice. And she said, Jonathan, how fortunate I was to be there. The Finks, the superintendents, did the best they could. I had a surrogate family there until the day I was reunited with my own. And Yemi Lester, who also only spoke well of being there with his sisters. Well, friends, I think it's time for me to stop talking. I've got a question up there, and in your tables of 4, or how many there are in your group, just talk with each other about this question. Coming to the present, and of course this is not limited to how we relate to Indigenous peoples specifically, can you think of any examples when this position of being against culture is the right one? What in the wider world warrants a stand in opposition? And how would you justify it as an expression of the gospel? So, 5 minutes. Go to it.
Well, I think one of the problems is that if you take a completely exclusionary attitude, then you're completely ignoring the world and all its evils. You're ignoring a good deal of the gospel. I mean, I suppose the classic is those who went off into the desert to maintain their purity. But what did that say to the culture that they were leaving behind?
And if it's a culture where there is abuse or harm being done, actually abrogating your responsibility as a Christian to either challenge that or be part of a life-giving love.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't use the word social justice. That sense of Jesus' concern for the well-being and the shalom of the whole of society, you know? To separate oneself from that is an abrogation of, for me, of a Christian.
Having said all that, of course, in fact, it's wrong to assume that the monasteries were completely separated from there. I mean, they were very much serving the culture.
Yes, they were the hospitals and the hospices of their era.
They were.
And they were also the agricultural forerunners, certainly in England, of doing things.
I think to begin with, they were out there.
I'm sorry?
They were out there, separate, but they came back in. And I think there used to be the story told where they would send out one of their runners to say, has the Lord come yet? They'd come and say, no, it's getting worse out there. And they tended to come back, and a couple of years later, send another run out. No, I don't think the Lord's out there, it's still getting worse. And then another day, a runner went out and said, hold on, I think the Lord's already out there. And it's a bit like, and I'll be mentioning this, how Christian civilization, Western was built more by the Benedictines and the other people. But I think the question here is, I think of the Barman Declaration where people like Bonhoeffer and there's something going on here we have to oppose. You know, is there anything, what could we name at the moment that's going on where we were to say, we are against that?
Yes, indeed. I suppose as you go into the world, there's this dialogue too. I mean, you're seeking to change the world is also going to change you. And it's the balance between the two, isn't it? Very much so.
For me, what do we need to stand out against? For me, it isn't ideas or theology, it's the basic things like there are so many people in Australia who are suffering because they're homeless. I'm not even talking about the floods.
Yeah, true.
They were hugely homeless, and there's the rising number of people in the older women like myself is the greatest growing homeless proportion of the population. Not many people realise that.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is not what we are as a society. It's not what Jesus was on about. Like, how do we challenge all that?
Yeah.
You know, but we're I don't know, politics comes into it at that point, of course. And our politicians, they just don't seem to have a vision of what I would call the shalomic understanding of Jesus. I just use that as a phrase that embeds.
I mean, there was a time when governments built lots of houses.
Yeah.
You had the housing commissions, the housing trust, that sort of thing.
Yep, that's what I mean.
Gradually it moved away from there to paying people
Yeah.
to subsidise their rent. But that's to assume that the
Yeah.
private sector
Yeah.
is going to respond, and clearly it hasn't.
Do you think, with all of what has happened, that there is actually a shift happening in our society at the moment back towards understanding of a greater good rather than the power of economics? You know, that the few rich, usually men, will get rich. I don't know. I actually have a feeling that there's something shifting in our culture.
I think governments are saying that if they can do things that they can tinker with the economy, they can respond to a pandemic in such a way. And of course it's got a backlash. I mean, all the people who are anti-vaxxers and think their freedom is being somehow violated by having to wear masks and all that sort of thing.
But there is also a majority that are saying, well, I'm prepared to put up with wearing a mask for the greater good.
The greater good, that's right.
And this concept of the greater good, this is what I'm meaning, is this beginning to shift back into our thinking in society? I don't know. I'm just asking that as a question.
I know. So, I mean, I don't know the answer, but I have
No,
the
there is no
impression
answer, but I think there's a shift happening.
Yes.
That people have been thinking along those lines. And things like the little acts of kindness, you know, and some of them are huge acts of kindness in the floods that we're seeing.
Yeah,
you know? That is what is important in life.
Sure.
I don't know. Sorry, we're probably off the topic of what you said.
But I think it's part. The problem is that people will respond to a crisis like that. But when it's a slow, long deterioration in whatever, housing provision and so on, almost as if it slips past our eyes without realising what's going on.
And because we don't have a setup where people with vision are there in our political leaders at the moment. They don't. Whereas before there were some great leaders, I think, that did have a sense of Christian understanding.
I'm amazed at Riderweek how many excellent former politicians we have who have stature, who are statesmen. And where are they now?
Whitlam used to give us 4% interest money to build houses. Mind, we grumbled because we said it's too expensive. And then, of course, when the interest rate got up to 15% or something, we suddenly realised how lucky we were. But all that's gone. All that's gone.
Yeah.
Well, thank
Anyway,
you.
All right.
there we go.
Okay.
That's good.
That's a start.
Good to have your microphone back again. Yeah, well.
Well, friends, we gather back, and I hope you had an interesting time reflecting on that question. I'm not going to ask for feedback tonight, but maybe over supper tonight we might be able to share some of the things we've come up with. Let's come down to, we're going to the top right-hand corner, where the relationship is one of affirming the cultural context in which we are, and I'm going to share some of the points that Niebuhr makes about this particular position. This position affirms that the Christian faith can be at home within its wider culture. There's no necessary conflict between the church and the world. Theologically, God in Christ is also the lover of the good earth. The original blessing precedes the myth of the fall. The life, ministry and teaching of Jesus is paramount. The Jesus of history matters most, more than the Christ of faith. This position affirms scriptural scholarship, and literalism is deemed to be fallacious. The Sermon on the Mount is paramount. And in the earlier pre-war liberal era, the kingdom of God was replaced with the brotherhood of man. Interestingly, Bob Hawke held to that view till his dying day. Now, his father was a liberal Christian, liberal minister, who incidentally, when I first started training for the ministry, I had the same principle that he had. But that's just by the way. God above all is a God of love. Jesus' death on the cross is such a powerful example of love that it has the power to transform the hardest of hearts. This is known as a moral influence metaphor of the atonement. The cultural formation of the West is inexplicably entwined with Christianity. We've already made that point. And while it may be problematic, there is much to affirm. There's a close affinity between liberal Christianity and the development of democracy and the primacy of individual conscience. Its luminaries include Abelard in the medieval period, Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr's brother, Paul Tillich, Harvey Cox, Carter Haywood, a feminist, Matthew Fox, and of course Jack Spong. But Niebuhr also points out the inadequacies of this relationship. For it can legitimise the social order despite offering criticism. There's such a hate of passing judgment, and that there's kind of a shyness about claiming what is the truth. Overemphasising goodness underplays the offence of the gospel. Naively underestimating demonic forces, especially social evil. And Reinhold Niebuhr's there's the example of Reinhold Niebuhr's withering critique of liberal theology's ability to deal with the realities of fascism and the Nazis. And in rejecting fundamentalism and crude atonement theories, liberal Christianity fails to have a robust redemptive theology which draws on the centrality of the cross and resurrection. In this position, reason trumps revelation. Grace is underplayed, giving way to self-reliant humanism, leading to therapies promising happiness. But this is a quote from Niebuhr, not in Christ and Culture, but from somewhere else. I can't read it here, so let me look up there. Where are we? No? There it is. A God without wrath brought human beings without sin into a kingdom without judgment through ministrations of a Christ without a cross. I don't know what you think of that. Well, I want to include on a slightly more positive note, and again I'm quoting Niebuhr, the relevance of this dynamic. This position brings into sharp focus elements in the teaching and life of Jesus in the New Testament that separatist Christians pass over. Jesus affirmed the laws of society. His mission was to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus took issue with the political parties of his nation and time. He was concerned for the peace of the city and found wise men in his day nearer to the kingdom of God than others. So, Niebuhr points out that the whole world is the sphere of God's activity. And Christians can affirm the movements of science and philosophy, the arts, as well as the causes which stand for justice and peace. The ultimate theological question is the question of God. How is this ultimate reality and activity we call God to be discerned in the going-onness of the historical process? Well, from this position, what are ways of relating to First Peoples? What follows? By far the majority of Christian missions had a negative view of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. even if their motivations may have been considered benign. This is a quote from the Reverend George Taplin at Point Macleay. He was a congregational minister, who said, "My mission is to promote the moral, spiritual and physical well-being of the natives." It's not negative, but he's assuming that their future was going to be with Western ways. There are instances, though, of genuine appreciation of First Nations people's cultures, and perhaps the most enlightened was Wilbur Chaseling at the time when Yirrkala Mission in the Go Peninsula was being established. He says this of that mission: "The purpose is to preserve Yolngu culture, to encourage the revival of old ceremonies, and to stimulate in the people an appreciation of their own social organisation, which has often suffered from alien contact. It is unjust for any alien to come up against primitive people for the purpose of upsetting their mode of life and converting them to living and thinking as he does." 1934. As an example of the mission playing a part in preserving traditional culture, Yirrkala stands out. Think of the Bark Petition in 1968, and think of Makarrata. That's where it comes from. And while planting the Christian faith, traditional culture was honoured and is honoured, and significant Christian leaders emerged. Significantly, the Reverend Dr. Ginny Inagondera, and associate him with the Rainbow Spirit theology. Now, Janine and I had our time, and we were privileged to live among the First Nation peoples of the Moanjum community in the Kimberleys, originally located far north in the Prince Regent River area at Kunmunya. And we were among people who still knew the most significant missionary, the Reverend J.R.B. Love, came from Strathalbyn, who was given the honorific title Dijaya, kind of like Papa, Father. And in his book published in 1936, he said this: "I yield to none in recognising the real intellectual ability of the Australian Aborigines. I honour their real and indeed intense religious sense and practices, and do not seek to overthrow these, but rather to use them as a basis for higher principles." That last bit, to use them as a basis for higher principles. We've got something, what he's saying, we white fellas have got something to learn from them. While we were at Moanjum, the community painted 3 Wandjinas on the back wall of the church. There it is. These ancestral dreaming figures were special to the 3 clan groups, the Warora, Narrandjin and Wunumbu nations. Wandjinas are creator spirits, evoking mystery, awe, and the recreative forces of nature after the cyclonic wet season. It's as if in this church there's a dialogue between 2 cultures. At one end there's the communion table, cross and pulpit, while at the other end the primal symbols of First Nation spirituality, special to the peoples of the West Kimberley. Each respects the other, each is a source of inspiration and empowerment, both have unique and meaningful stories to live by, and for some it's possible to live by both. The other picture I have here is of Donnie Woolagudge's recent book, which reminded me again of how different traditional culture is from Western Judeo-Christian culture. Many seek to merge the two, and that's often done. And quite often that's a choice of First Nations people themselves. But I believe this is fraught with difficulty, merging the two, for the danger is to diminish the integrity of traditional culture and spirituality. Donnie, always on the edge of what we were doing when we were at Moanjum. He didn't want to be tainted by whitefella education. He was taken off, and his father, a great elder, a leader at Moanjum, taught Donnie the law, And it so happens that he's perhaps the best of that community in being able to articulate, in these days, who's alive, the culture of that community. Now, I'm going to give you a bit more time in groups. Can you think of examples of the within culture position being applicable today? And again, this, because I've been talking about relating to First Nations people, that doesn't necessarily specifically lead into this question, although I'm sure it still can apply. Where do you see God at work, or the purposes of God at work in the wider community? Just 5 minutes.
I've got a query about Richard Niebuhr.
Yeah.
Weren't the Niebuhrs early champions of Bach?
They probably were. Most people were. And Niebuhr. But then there were those who moved beyond Bach and his rather stringent, the otherness of God was so emphasised that it seemed to them that somehow that did not lead into affirming the world in which we lived.
Because you wouldn't put Bart in that category, would you?
Oh no, he's down here.
Oh, he's
Yeah,
down there.
yeah.
He's down here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
But of course, his framing of the Barman Declaration came out of his theology.
True. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Can you think of examples of the within culture
Yes.
position? What do you mean by that? Of the within culture
Well, this is
position?
within culture. Where can you see
Okay.
the spirit of God, or whatever it is, the agenda of the
being
God at
applicable
work, or
today.
where?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because in some ways we are a more caring society than we once were. Western culture is more caring. I mean, we used to refer to these places as bedlams, you know, when we put people who behave differently from ourselves and all that sort of thing. Kids in the right sort of families don't get belted up regularly because of minor infractions, all that sort of thing. School teachers can no longer bring out the cane and that sort of thing. There's a sense in which we have moved away from aggression being very much part of our social transactions. But on the other hand, we drop bombs on people and all the rest of it. It's a difficult one.
I guess for me, one of the signs of where we can affirm is, I think that it was just a wonderful thing that the plebiscite we had about same-sex marriage.
About
same-sex marriage.
yeah.
How strong the movement was for people to say yes to that. And it's a bit like, you know, that was something happening. It's a bit like people say the arc of history bends towards justice. Now, I'm not quite sure about that. I think that can be too easily said, but there's something in it. And then I think that somehow the seeds were sown. Sometimes the seeds are sown by Christians.
Oh yeah.
You know, I have to say,
Oh, yes.
the first people who I knew were affirming of homosexuality were ministers in the Congregational Church.
Absolutely.
And I'm talking about the 50s,
Yes.
or about
Yeah.
the time
Yes.
of Dr. Duncan's death.
Yep.
But nevertheless, I'm not. I think it's in the wider society where these movements happen and get picked up,
Sure.
which I think fulfil what we could, with those of us, you know, who are lovers of justice, who would say that is the divine purpose, if you want to call it that.
I think there's a degree of Christianity that it was to do with God of judgment and the whole sense of judgment within society. And because the power of Christianity is lessened, or the official power of Christianity is lessened, that sense of divine right to judge, and you as white male political guy or whatever, or in a person of power, being able to judge over somebody else. I'm not explaining this very well, but I think that's lessened.
Yeah.
As the power of Christianity is lessened. This is the Christendom power I'm talking about. I think. Yeah.
One of the challenges for Christianity, perhaps the challenge, is sometimes being ahead of the culture, sometimes being behind. I mean, let's face it, huge areas of the Christian church still don't allow women to officiate the communion. And I mean, the wider culture, the wider Western culture has long since understood that women can do everything men can. And yet you've got these areas in the church.
Well, this is, as you've been doing your talk, this is what I've been sitting here saying, well, what culture are we talking about? Because what is it that women, as part of a culture, have been suffering from as well, for the last 2,000 years? There's been subversive stuff going on amongst women that do things differently anyway, just as there's been subversive stuff amongst Aboriginal folks doing things differently. I'm not explaining that.
No, but you're also saying that what I'm doing tonight is very surface. I mean, underneath is a whole mishmash and all kinds of
it's complex.
More complex things.
Oh, it's complex.
Yeah,
It's very complex.
That's right.
And then how does... you're helping us talk about it by being able to bring things to the surface.
And the other thing, of course, is that the pace of cultural change is accelerated enormously.
True.
Enormously.
True. And the spread of things being done differently. I mean, we think the Christian message isn't being spread, but there's the pastor of my old church. She puts her stuff on podcasts, and these podcasts are going out to hundreds of people who don't even set foot inside a church.
This is down at Seaford?
This is in WA.
Oh, in WA, great.
Yeah, Karen Slum. And she's a scientist as well as a theologian. She puts it, and it speaks to people.
Oh, we better...
Yeah, you better get hold of her.
Get her on our...
Oh, she's part of the mob.
Right,
Okay.
right.
Aggressive mob. Common dreams and all of that.
Yeah.
I can tell from the buzz that I'm going to be interrupting you, so my apologies for that. And you'll be pleased to know that you may be looking at your time. I'm not spending nearly much the same amount of time on at least the next two. I'm going to be moving quickly. Let's move to the faith above culture that Niebuhr talks about. This position flowered first in the medieval period after the collapse of the Roman Empire, while the Constantinian adoption of Christianity heralded Christendom. It was, and we were talking about this in our group, it was the religious orders that emerged when the monastic movement got involved again. It's a bit like society had so collapsed, everybody looked around and said, who's going to fix it? And the Benedictines, for example, were there. They helped shape the social fabric of Europe. A church in the centre of every village and a cathedral in every provincial city. Yes, the emperor sat on a throne, but he was crowned by the symbolic successor to Peter. This position affirms the social order and likes to think that it's not subservient to it, it is above. Thank you. However, when two orders wield power, it's often the one with the sword which triumphs. Niebuhr lists the inadequacies of this relationship, and I'm not giving its due credit, of course, I'm moving on a bit quickly here, but he says what the problem is that this position absolutises the relative and reduces the infinite to finite form. This is why from this position it's almost impossible to accept GLBTQI people. They don't fit into the fixed schema. Here the church too is sometimes synonymous with the kingdom of God. An entrenched hierarchy stifles the voice of the laity, women, all of whom are disempowered. always lags behind scientific discovery. I mean, how long did it take for Galileo to be no longer a heretic? Now, I could go on, but I don't want to sound sectarian here, because I'm still a person who applauded Vatican II and the changes that it's made, and I deeply regret how so many of these reforms have been wound back. I guess the relevance of this dynamic is that its unique globality, it's Catholic. It brings order, which is not to be discounted. And there's a strong emphasis on natural law, and it's a sign of affirming the created order, something very, very pertinent to our world today. Somehow it's attractive to intellectuals. Think of luminaries like Cardinal Newman. What about their ways of relating to First Peoples? Well, there's a check with history. Just think of how Catholicism replaced the sacred rites of the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Incas and other cultures, placing Christianity above them on the assumption that they were all cultures of darkness. But not so extreme. What do you think of this quote from Bishop Gazelle of New Norcia in Western Australia? The problem arises when the unargued assumption that criticism of aspects of another culture and efforts to change it are inherently wrong. These fine talkers enjoy the benefits of Christian civilization. The heathens are men as we are, and as such they have the same right that we have to the benefits of Christianity. Now, you could probably read that in more than one way, but I want to just refer to one instance of something of this old Catholic type of mission in Australia. Guess where it was? In the Kimberleys, Columbaroo, Drysdale River in Western Australia. The priest in charge, and by the way, a Benedictine order, and I find that kind of ironic, Father Sands was the Spanish priest in charge of Columbaroo. He never spoke English too well. We tried to meet him when we were at the Moanjum community. We could never get to him. You had to get his permission to even visit. But he sent to us at Moanjum troublesome young men, expecting Moanjum elders to sort them out. Usually it was some, I would call, minor misdemeanour, probably sexual, that had them sent to us. Father Sands had total control. The Aboriginal people there had no say at all. He couldn't abide self-determination policies, so when he was forced out, unfortunately, the community collapsed. They hadn't been prepared in any way for self-determination. He implanted a strict form of Christianity, opposed all traditional practices. However, he couldn't police everything. The people still did their ceremonies out in the bush, out of sight. But I have a far more positive impression of the Catholic missions in the Northern Territory, at Port Keats, or What Eyes it's called now, Santa Teresa, the Tiwi Islands. We had many students come from the Tiwi Islands and these places, Santa Teresa, to Nungalinga College. They were students who were all proud and very self-affirming. In relating to traditional culture, it seemed to me that while affirming it, there appeared to be an uncanny ability to incorporate traditional culture and religious symbols into, let's say, Christian worship. Christianity is still above culture. And yet I think these days it's far more nuanced, and I may be a little unfair in my judgments there. But I thrill at the wonderful artwork of Miriam Rose Barman. Do you remember her? I think she was an Australian of the Year earlier this year. And I particularly like her Stations of the Cross. Well, let's bring us to Christian faith alongside culture. This is the one in the bottom right-hand corner of the chart. This is a both-and relationship, two separate spheres in tension. Richard Niebuhr called it Christ and culture in paradox. And there's one very important scriptural text from St. Paul. I'll read it out. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. While being at times against things in the civil order, the essential task was to obey it, for it too is accountable to God and Christ. Niebuhr said, Christ is both judge and redeemer of culture. And of course, Martin Luther, above all, is the framer of this position. Now, I'm not doing it justice, Mike, so you'll excuse me if I go on to say what are the inadequacies of this position. I think there always was a danger of a lingering assent to the dominance of the civil order. After all, it was the princes who decided to adopt Lutheranism. So always beholden to the civil realm, especially if it supports the church financially. That was an issue, of course, that Bonhoeffer was dealing with in the 1930s in the church then. But there's kind of an echo here of the early controversy in South Australia over state aid to religion. We were opposed to it. When I say we, the ascendancy in the province of South Australia. We're not going to have any established church here. But again, when the state funds you, you are beholden. Aged care, education, I won't say any more. The relevance of this dynamic is that to Luther was clear that the civil order culture is where Christ was to be followed. The culture of society is a good thing. It needs to be taught. Just think of Johann Sebastian Bach. What about relating to First Nations? I'm going to read this from Carl Strello of 1914, who said, to separate the black children from their parents, and by the way, this is not the stolen generations, but a reference to other missions. Children were put into dormitories and that kind of thing. And forbid them to speak, aranda, to each other, and where possible drive the old people away from the station, I will never consent to. My mission instructions are to preach the gospel to the whole creation, which is only possible in an effective way in the native language. This practice is followed in missions everywhere too, except in Australia, which takes a unique position on this as in much else. Well, the Finke River mission of the Lutheran Church in Australia is best known for its work at Hermannsburg, a remarkable story of persistence and courage against all the odds, noted for the affirmation of the Aranda language. And it seems to me that the missionaries carried over, though, the two spheres motive in their endeavours. On the one hand, we have the remarkable anthropological collection of the Strellos, which I don't think is available to the First Nation peoples yet, and a church which does not seem to integrate any traditional culture into its life. Its biggest strength is its pastoral leadership. And this is remarkable in Australia, and we in the Uniting Church sometimes forget this. For example, 26 Aboriginal Lutheran pastors serve more than 45 communities in the main Central Australian language areas, or still supported by the Finke River mission of the Lutheran Church of Australia. However, it does contrast with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress and their unique place in the Uniting Church. Now, for something different. A curious fact. Those who resisted the claims of empire forged a faith which became embedded in European civilization. We're now talking about the one in the middle. Transforming culture. Christian faith transforming culture. Contemporary writers like James Boyce, and that's a copy of his book called Born Bad, and Tom Holland, whose book Dominion and the Making of the Western Mind Fergus is going to talk about later on in the year, observe that even in a secularised society, there is a culturally embedded DNA in Western society whose origin is the Christian faith. For example, now original sin is sociological, in that there is a society, that in society there is the assumption that humans are born bad, so flawed that they need salvation, even if it may be therapy or social engineering. Everyone wants to be a rescuer or rescued. Yes, Western culture has been transformed for good or ill by Christianity. At the same time, there is a seeming opposite, deeply implanted image that humans' life and the creation are fundamentally good. So you have born bad, fundamentally good. Is this the tension of being in the world but not necessarily of the world? So this dynamic, the one that seeks to transform culture, is realistic about the flaws of society, but it's hopeful. It's clear about the structural nature of dehumanising forces which emerge, and that humans can intervene to change the social order. Niebuhr sees Jesus himself as the transformer of life. Names associated with this dynamic are Calvin, Augustine, despite some wacky theology elsewhere, Richard Niebuhr himself, Martin Luther King Jr., Gustavo Gutierrez, liberation theologian, Mary Gray, feminist theologian. And a new atonement metaphor has emerged called Participatory Liberation, inspired by liberation theology, where the crucified risen Christ is identified with those who are the oppressed and marginalised. Niebuhr wrote that the church is truly the church when, as social pioneer, it acts representationally on behalf of others. This is the movemental dynamic. There are many historical examples: Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. I'd include Mahatma Gandhi, who read the Bible daily. In relating to First Nations, though, I'm very cautious here because I'm sensitive to daring to suggest how traditional culture may be transformed and changed by the colonisers. There's been so much damage done. I've been to Galawinko, Elko Island, and heard the grief caused when missionaries who were beloved but ignorant ceremoniously burned their sacred objects. But let me mention one that plays an ongoing role in both the Torres Straits and the Pacific, Vanuatu in particular. It's the coming of the light. Have you heard of it? What is this? It celebrates the coming of the gospel by the London Missionary Society. I think there's a date on there that says 1871. Is that what it says? The core significance is that the light of the gospel is love and forgiveness. And I'm told, and this may need checking, that in Islander culture there's no word for love. And I'm sure they had words for sexual love, but not brotherly or sisterly love. Warfare was endemic, headhunting a way of life. The message of the gospel was embraced as the coming of the light, for it was a liberation from continuing conflict. Now I'm going to skip giving you another opportunity to go into groups because time's caught up with us, and I want to come back and sum all this up this way. But there's the question. What's the top of your list of what in the world warrants transformation today? And it's a bit like the last question, I realise. So you've got these 5 positions. Is there one to be favoured? Niebuhr contended that each one has its moment in time as a faithful and relevant response. Let's think of example of Bonhoeffer, for example. He started off as a good Lutheran, where there was that paradox between the civil and the religious realm. He was very much planted there, but as things got worse in Germany, he goes over and really goes with the against culture position and becomes one of the signers of the Barman Declaration, sets up the theological college at Finkelwald to train this movemental expression of the church that was opposed to the official German church and, of course, Hitler. But then I think he ends up in the middle, transforming culture. He feels you've got to sometimes put a spoke in the wheel to change things. So he was party to the attempt to assassinate Hitler. And he's the one that came up with this phrase, I see now that the theology now has to be done from below, which of course is what liberation theology was all about. And maybe you and I have been in any one of those positions during our lifetimes. But I want to conclude by asking, where are we now in the relationship with First Nations peoples? How might Niebuhr's typology apply? Against? Well, there are those who still think they ought to be like us. Olga's story last week of the Russian women, but that can be retold many times with many different groups. Assumes needing to let go of identity and being civilised like us. I think it's good to name what we're up against. Now, while I personally argue against this position, there are many First Nations people who adhere to a conservative, world-negating faith. And I'd like to suggest they need respect. The grace of the gospel means personal healing, particularly where there are communities where grog, dysfunctionality and violence prevails. And it may be a majority of First Nation Christians are conservative evangelicals. Within, of course, here there remains a strong affirmation of culture, resistance to racism and proud to be Aboriginal. But be cautious of white romanticism. I picked up this theme at Risers Week this week. There's ways in which we, white people, Ballina as we're called in the Northern Territory, want to appropriate their culture, thinking that somehow their spirituality will save us. Theologically, I'm suspicious of syncretism, but First Nations culture needs to be recognised for what it is. The above culture position today, well, there is the ever-present expectation that you will join our club, but let's affirm First Nation peoples who've already embraced faith, finding a safe place here, where Christianity and traditional spirituality are honoured in a kind of synthesis. But then, living in two worlds. That's what I call, There may be a continuing case for this position. This is the Lutheran, what I typified the old Lutheran position. There may be a continuing case for this position, particularly if the strong church leadership can turn their ministry outwards to lead in the religious and social transformation that make it a church for others. But it's the transforming culture one I want to conclude with. The present moment is blessed with a multiplicity of amazingly strong First Nations leaders and communities and people. I see a new determination to be who you are, to identify as First Nations without ignoring multiple origins, where that is the story. But I think the transformation that would be miraculous is if a fundamental change in the national psyche of the Australian nation happens. We're the ones who have to be transformed. And this can happen if we accept the invitation to walk with them, to walk with First Nation people, to support them in the implementation of a voice to the nation enshrined in the Constitution. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is truly a great gift to Australia. Here is the possibility of transformation. The Church's task is to listen, walk with, advocate and do all we can to convince the majority of Australians to support the statement. Many people are still sitting on the fence. So friends, let there be a social movement which reimagines a new identity of Australia. Is this not what we are called to at this moment of history? And as the church in its three dynamics. That's it.
Are you going to answer questions?
I'm glad to, but it is 8:20.
Probably. If you have questions, ask Jonathan over supper. Would that
That'd
be
be
a good
great.
idea?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for sharing with us out of your experience and your knowledge and such wide-ranging, interesting discussions we had at our table anyway. So thank you. And the notices for next week, we
on
have
the
Ken
screen.
Sumner, who's speaking on colonisation and its effects on culture. Oh,
There it
it's
is.
up here. The influence of colonisation on faith. So that should be interesting. And there are two flyers that we'd like you to take. One about supporting the Uluru Statement, and there are copies of this on the table where you came in. And another one there, what are civil liberties all about? A session being held with Rick Sarr on the 31st of March at 7:30, and it's being held here, I guess, at the Effective Living Centre. So there's a flyer about that as well that you can take as you leave. So thank you for your attendance tonight. If you weren't here last time and you want a copy of Olga's presentation, there are copies on the table, and her video of the session last week is now up online on the ELC PCNet website. So thank you for your attendance. We hope to see you next week. You would, but not take that.